The Hall of Concordance was the most powerful room in the known galaxy. It sat at the center of Axis Prime, a massive station floating in neutral space between star systems. 47 species had built it together 200 years ago when they decided that talking was better than killing. The walls were tall and smooth, carved from pale stone brought from a dozen different worlds. The seats curved in a wide circle, and every single chair was filled today. 3 humans stood in the middle of the floor. Admiral Diplomat Sarah Voss stood straight. She was a tall woman, past 60, with short gray hair and dark eyes that had seen a great deal. Beside her was her aide, Kofi Annan Reyes, a young man who kept his hands clasped in front of him and his face calm, even though his heart was hammering hard against his ribs. On his other side stood Dr. Lena Marsh, a xenobiologist who had spent 30 years building connections between human and alien science. She had not slept well in a very long time. They were on trial. The charges had been read 3 times already, in 3 different languages. Conspiracy, sabotage, treason against the Concordat. Specifically, they were accused of plotting to destroy the Helix Gate network, the chain of jump points that allowed faster-than-light travel across the galaxy. Without the Helix Gates, trade stopped. Ships drifted for years between worlds. Empires went silent. The gates were the most important thing in the known universe, and someone had tried to damage them. The Varek said it was these 3 humans. The Varek were the most powerful species in the Concordat. They were tall, narrow, and cold, with smooth gray chitin and eyes that caught the light like mirrors. They were brilliant and patient and very, very good at waiting. They had controlled the Helix Gates for 400 years, and they intended to control them for 400 more. They had not liked the way humans had been pushing lately, asking uncomfortable questions about shared access, neutral oversight, fair pricing. They had not liked it at all. So they had made a plan. The evidence against Voss, Annan Reyes, and Marsh was perfect. It had taken the Varek decades to build. Forged communications, fabricated ship logs, a false trail so carefully laid that it looked like the truth from every angle. Even the best human legal minds had spent 3 months looking for cracks, and they had found very few. Ambassador Haruto Daichi stood and argued for 2 full hours. He was the sharpest legal mind in the Sol Federation, and he used every tool available to him. He tore apart the timeline. He questioned how the evidence had been collected and handled. He pointed out that all 3 of the accused had been under Concordat observation during the period in question, which made direct involvement nearly impossible. The alien delegates shifted in their seats. A few of the smaller species leaned together and whispered. A strange feeling began to move through the hall. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, the truth was about to matter. Then the Grand Arbiter stood. He was old, even for a Varek. His chitin had gone almost white with age. He moved slowly to the central podium and placed a flat silver disc on the surface. He pressed 1 finger to it. The verdict appeared on every screen in the room at the same moment. Guilty. Sentence, death. There was no appeal. The Concordat Charter allowed for immediate execution in cases of crimes against galactic infrastructure. The Grand Arbiter had already signed the order before he walked through the door that morning. It was finished in less than 4 minutes. The execution was not done quietly or in private. They broadcast it on every Concordat frequency. Every planet, every orbital station, every ship in the network received the live transmission. It was not just a punishment. It was a demonstration. A message sent to every species watching, but aimed at one in particular. Humans were to understand, once and for all, exactly where they stood. Sarah Voss did not beg. She looked directly into the broadcast lens until the very end. Kofi Annan Reyes closed his eyes and moved his lips. A prayer, or a name, no one would ever know for certain. Dr. Lena Marsh said 1 word out loud near the end. Those close enough to read her lips said it looked like the word, remember. Then the transmission cut to black. In Geneva, in the Joint Command Center buried 6 floors beneath the street, every screen had been live. Every officer in the room had watched in complete silence. The room was full of senior people, fleet commanders, generals, intelligence directors, diplomatic heads, and not one of them had spoken or moved during the broadcast. When it ended, the silence held for a long time. A junior lieutenant near the back of the room began to cry. She made no effort to hide it. No one looked at her. General Mara Okonkwo stood near the front. She was a broad, steady woman in her late 50s, with close-cropped hair and a face that did not show much even on ordinary days. She had commanded the Seoul Defense Fleet for 9 years. She had seen war. She had seen what organized power did to the powerless when there was nothing left to stop it. She had a cup of coffee in her hand that had gone cold over an hour ago. She set it down on the nearest console. She straightened her jacket. She turned to look at the room. Not with a speech, not with tears. She looked at the people around her, the way someone looks when a decision has already been made, and all that is left is the work. "Get me a full inventory," she said quietly, "of everything we've been holding back." Nobody asked what she meant. Every person in that room already knew. Across the galaxy, the broadcast ended in different kinds of silence, on different worlds. On Lethian colony stations, families turned off their screens and sat without talking. A young Lethian diplomat named Jari watched the feed from her office on Axis Prime. She did not turn the screen off for a very long time. She sat with her hands folded on her desk, staring at the blank feed long after it went dark. On Varric Prime, the High Council chambers filled with something that might have been called satisfaction. Councillor Veth Saran, the man who had planned the entire thing, accepted quiet congratulations from his colleagues. He believed, with complete certainty, that the matter was now closed. He believed humanity had learned something important today. He was right about that. He just had no idea what they had learned. On Earth, people stepped out into the streets, not shouting, not burning anything, just standing in the cold air in every major city, looking up at the sky without speaking. Some held candles. Some held printed pictures of the 3 faces that had been on every screen: Voss, Annan Reyes, Marsh. 3 names that would not be forgotten. In the Geneva Command Center, the lights stayed on all through the night. Deep in the asteroid belts at the far edge of human space, in shipyards that appeared on no Concordat registry and no official map, systems that had been waiting in silence for decades began, very quietly, to wake up. Councillor Veth Saran reviewed the human military file for the 3rd time that week, and for the 3rd time, he closed it feeling completely calm. The numbers were clear. The Sol Federation maintained a declared fleet of 412 warships, spread across 9 systems, respectable for a mid-tier species, entirely insufficient against the Varric Ascendancy's combined naval force of over 3,000 vessels. Not counting allied Concordat contingents, humanity had no meaningful allies. Their technology was good, but not exceptional. Their soldiers were known to be aggressive and difficult to predict, but aggression without numbers was just noise. Veth Saran set the file down and looked out the tall window of his office on Varric Prime. The sky was the color of copper in the early light. He had spent 40 years building toward what happened in the Hall of Concordance, and it had gone precisely as planned. The humans would make noise for a while. They would petition. They would send angry transmissions. And then slowly, they would accept the new shape of things, the same way every other species had eventually accepted it. He had seen it many times before. What Veth Saran did not know, what no Varric knew, and no alien species in the Concordat knew, was that the file he had just closed was not the real one. The real picture of human military strength had never been submitted to any Concordat registry. It existed in secure vaults beneath the surface of 3 different moons, accessible only to a small group of people inside the Sol Federation's most classified directorate. The project had no public name. Internally, those who built it called it Stillwater. Stillwater had begun 83 years earlier, quietly, after a young human analyst named Dr. Priya Chowdhury submitted a report to the Seoul Security Council that nobody wanted to read. It looked at the history of the Concordat, not the official history taught in schools, but the real record of what had happened to smaller species over the centuries. The Lethians had their homeworld's orbit moved by Varick infrastructure projects without consent. The Korathi had their ancient trade routes reclassified and taxed into poverty. The Sundri had been stripped of voting rights for 60 years over a diplomatic dispute that historians now agreed was manufactured. Dr. Chowdhury's report said one thing clearly: the Concordat was not a council of equals. It was a hierarchy with nice furniture. And history showed, without exception, that hierarchies of this kind eventually moved against whoever threatened their top position. Humanity was starting to ask too many questions. That made humanity a threat. The report recommended that the Sol Federation begin a quiet, long-term program of military development. Not for conquest, but for survival. It recommended they tell the Concordat nothing about it. The Security Council sat on the report for 2 years. Then they approved it. For 83 years, hidden shipyards had been carved into asteroid belts and deep space rocks at the far edges of human territory. Funding was buried inside infrastructure budgets, research grants, and colonial development programs. Engineers and scientists who worked on Stillwater signed agreements that made ordinary classified clearance look casual. Whole families had lived and died without ever mentioning their work to the outside world. The result was something that had no equivalent in any alien threat assessment. It was not simply more ships, though there were many more ships. Over 2,000 vessels that no Concordat record acknowledged. It was the quality of what those ships carried that mattered most. Human engineers had spent decades studying alien weapons technology, absorbing it, and then doing what humans had always done, pulling it apart and putting it back together in ways the original designers had never imagined. Varek beam weapons that were already highly efficient had been made 30% more powerful. Lethian stealth systems had been rebuilt from scratch and combined with human sensor spoofing technology into something no scanner in the galaxy was currently calibrated to detect. There were also things that were entirely human in origin. For centuries, before they ever reached the stars, humans had been fighting each other. Wars on a single planet, with nowhere to run and no outside help coming. They had developed weapons of enormous destructive power out of sheer necessity, and then they had developed the discipline to control those weapons, because the alternative was the end of everyone. That particular combination, the ability to cause tremendous damage, paired with the will to hold back, was not something the Varick had ever needed to build into themselves. They had always had the stars to expand into. They had never been cornered. Humans had been cornered many times. They remembered what it felt like. General Mara Okonkwo stood in the central operations room of a Stillwater facility 3 days after the execution, looking at a display that showed the full scope of what had been quietly built over the better part of a century. She had known the numbers for years, of course, but seeing them laid out in front of her now felt different. It felt like standing at the edge of something that could not be walked back from. She did not look away. She turned to the small group of officers and directors standing behind her. "We're not going to move yet," she said. "We're going to give them a chance first." She paused. "1 chance. Clear terms. 30 days. One of the officers, a man named Director Calloway, who had spent his entire career inside Stillwater, asked her what she thought the Varick would do when they received the ultimatum. Okonkwo thought about it honestly. "I think they'll laugh," she said. "I think Veth Saran will read it, share it with his colleagues, and they'll all agree that humanity is confused about its own size." She picked up a datapad from the table beside her. "And then we'll find out whether they're smart enough to be afraid of being wrong." The Sol ultimatum was transmitted on a full Concordat-wide channel 4 days after the execution. It was not written in the language of anger. It was written in the language of bureaucratic precision, which was somehow colder. It listed 3 demands. First, a full public acknowledgement from the Concordat that the evidence used to convict Voss, Annan Reyes, and Marsh had been fabricated. Second, the removal of Varick exclusive control over the Helix Gate network and the establishment of neutral joint administration. Third, a complete renegotiation of humanity's status and rights within the Concordat, with equal standing under the new framework. It gave the Council 30 standard days to respond. It said nothing about what would happen if they did not. There was not a single threat in the entire document. That detail frightened 3 Concordat councillors enough that they quietly voted in favor of opening negotiations. They were outvoted. The motion was formally tabled. Veth Saran read the ultimatum in his office on Varick Prime, and then he did exactly what Okonkwo had predicted. He shared it with his senior colleagues. There was laughter, controlled, dignified Varick laughter, but laughter nonetheless. The clock began. Jari, the young Lethian diplomat on Axis Prime, read the ultimatum in her office the same evening. She did not laugh. She read it twice. Then she opened a secure channel to a human diplomatic contact she had been quietly maintaining for 2 years, and she began to type. She had information about the fabricated evidence. She had been sitting on it, afraid. She was still afraid, but she was more afraid now of what it meant to keep sitting on it. She sent the message and closed the channel, and sat in the dark of her office for a long time, wondering if she had just changed the direction of her life entirely. The 30 days did not pass quickly. They passed in the way that time passes before something unavoidable, slowly, with weight, each hour feeling a little heavier than the one before it. Different worlds experienced those 30 days in different ways, but none of them passed without noticing the clock. On Varick Prime, a military commander named Fleetmaster Droveth spent the first week pulling old records. He was not a politician. He had no involvement in the trial or the executions. He was a soldier, and soldiers had a habit of looking at things politicians preferred to ignore. He pulled up every piece of historical data on human warfare that existed in the Concordat archives, which was not a great deal. Humans had been members for only 200 years, and they had spent most of that time seeming unremarkable. But Droveth was thorough. He found older records, pre-contact material recovered from human data systems, when the first Concordat survey ships had reached the Sol system. He found accounts of wars fought across a single small planet, with weapons of mass destruction used and threatened with a frequency that made his kitten pull tight. He found records of conflicts that had lasted decades, where one side had been outmatched in every measurable way and had simply refused to stop fighting until there was nothing left to fight with. He found a pattern that no Varek military doctrine had ever needed to plan against, because it made no rational sense. Humans did not calculate the odds. Or rather, they calculated them, understood they were losing, and continued anyway. Droveth wrote a classified report. He sent it to the High Council, with a note that said plainly that he believed negotiation was the correct course of action. The Council reviewed it. They filed it. No one responded to him. He sat in his office, on the 14th day, and looked at the wall, and felt, for the first time in a long career, genuinely uncertain about the future. On a Lethian colony world called Verath Station, the 30 days felt different. The Lethians were not a warlike species. They were careful people, patient and thoughtful, who had learned centuries ago that the best way to survive in the Concordat was to stay small and quiet and cause no trouble. But Zari's leaked communications had been spreading through Lethian networks for a week now, copied and forwarded and discussed in hushed meetings across their territory. The transmissions contained detailed evidence that the trial had been rigged, that the 3 humans had been innocent. Most Lethians read it and felt sick. They had watched the broadcast. Many of them had looked away. That was the thing that was hardest to sit with now. Not just that it had happened, but that they had watched and said nothing and looked away. An old Lethian historian named Counselor Brevos, no relation to the human ambassador, gave a quiet talk to a small group of junior diplomats on day 18. He did not call for action. He was too old and too careful for that. But he told them something he had never said publicly before. He told them that he had been alive when the Varric had restructured Lethian orbital trade routes without consent, 60 years ago. He had been a young man. He had watched his government protest and be ignored. He had watched his people get poorer and quieter and smaller over the following decade. He told them that silence, over time, had a cost, that the bill eventually came due. The young diplomats listened and said nothing, but several of them began, very carefully, reaching out to contacts in other neutral species. Slowly and privately, a shape was forming among the smaller members of the Concordat. Not a coalition, not yet, but a shared awareness that what happened next would matter for everyone. On Axis Prime, a group of Korathi and Sundry counselors attempted to organize an emergency mediation session during the third week. The Varric representatives did not attend. They sent a written response instead, stating that there was nothing to mediate. Because humanity's ultimatum was not a legitimate diplomatic action, but an act of aggression by a member species against the governing body. They said the matter would be addressed after the 30 days expired, at which point humanity would face formal censure. The Korathi lead counselor read the response, and then folded it very precisely, and placed it in a drawer, and did not take it out again. On Earth, the 30 days were the longest that many people could remember. There were public funerals on day 4. 3 coffins, draped in the blue and white of the Sol Federation, carried through the streets of Geneva, while millions stood in silence along the route. The faces of Sarah Voss, Kofi Annan Reyes, and Lena Marsh had been everywhere since the broadcast. On walls, on screens, printed and painted and projected. A poet named Amara Diallo published a piece on day 6 that spread through human space faster than any news transmission. It did not call for war. It simply described what it felt like to watch 3 people die for telling the truth. It was read aloud at the funerals. General Okonkwo attended the funerals in full dress uniform. A journalist caught a photograph of her face during the procession. It was a photograph that circulated widely in the days that followed, not because of what it showed, but because of what it did not show. There was no rage in her face, no grief breaking the surface, just a steadiness so complete it looked almost like peace, and wasn't. Aboard the Sol Federation flagship, a ship called the ISCS Unbroken, a young lieutenant commander named Yusuf Adeyemi spent the 30 days doing something that his senior officers did not comment on, because they understood it without needing to. He was writing letters home, long ones, one to his mother in Lagos, one to his younger sister who was studying engineering on Titan, one to an old friend from the academy he had not spoken to in 2 years. He was not writing them because he expected to die. He was writing them because humans always did this before something big. They wrote things down. They made sure the people they cared about knew they were cared about. They documented. It was, his commanding officer once said, one of the strangest and most human things there was. On day 29, a private transmission came through a back channel from a Varec diplomatic office to a human contact point in Geneva. It was not signed. It said, "Your demands are unreasonable. We suggest you reconsider your position before consequences become unavoidable." General Okonkwo read the message. She typed a response herself, without asking anyone else's opinion. 2 words. Day 30. Day 30 arrived on a Tuesday morning, Geneva time. The Concordat council chambers were full. Every species had sent representatives. The hall was quiet, in a way that felt like held breath. The Varric Grand Arbiter took the podium and read the council's formal response to the Seoul ultimatum in a clear, measured voice. The demands were rejected. All three. The ultimatum itself was declared an act of sedition against the Concordat. Humanity was informed that legal proceedings against the Seoul Federation would begin within the standard month. He finished speaking. The chamber was very still. Then the human channel, which had been open and live during the reading, went quiet. Not cut, just quiet. 4 seconds of empty air, long enough for everyone listening to notice it, to feel the weight of it. Then the channel closed. Yusuf Adeyemi sealed his letters and gave them to the ship's communications officer with instructions to hold them. Around him, the crew of the Unbroken moved with the quiet, practiced focus of people who had been ready for a long time. In the hidden shipyards at the edge of human space, the lights were already on. The Stillwater fleet did not move like an angry thing. It moved like a plan. 2014 warships departed from their hidden positions in the asteroid belts and deep space rocks of the outer Sol territories in the early hours after the channel closed. They did not travel in one great mass. They split into precise groups, each one assigned a specific target, each one running on a schedule that had been calculated and recalculated over years. There were no dramatic speeches broadcast across the fleet. General Okonkwo had given the operational order in 11 words. Execute Stillwater. Protect the gates. Do not fire unless fired upon. The Varek had built their empire on the Helix Gate network. Every supply line, every troop movement, every trade route between their worlds ran through those gates. Control the gates, and you controlled the flow of everything. The Varek had understood this for 400 years. What they had not fully understood was that someone else had spent 80 years quietly learning exactly the same lesson. Okonkwo's strategy did not aim to destroy. It aimed to take. Within 9 hours of the fleet's departure, the first wave of human ships arrived at 17 Helix Gate nodes simultaneously. The Varek garrison forces stationed at those nodes were not small, but they were built to discourage interference, not to fight a coordinated military operation of this scale. More importantly, they had never seen a human warship that did not match the Concordat registry. When the first Stillwater vessels dropped out of stealth at point-blank range, the garrison commanders spent several seconds simply trying to understand what they were looking at. Several seconds was enough. Gate after gate went dark to Varek control. Lockout codes, prepared long in advance by human engineers who had spent years quietly studying Helix Gate architecture, were uploaded through captured access terminals. The gates still worked, ships could still pass through them, but only with human authorization. The Varek Empire, spread across dozens of systems, suddenly found itself in a position that no Varek strategic model had ever seriously considered. Isolated, piece by piece, inside its own territory. Vethsaran received the first reports in his private chambers and did not believe them. He called for confirmation. The confirmation came. He called for more confirmation. The picture did not change. He stood very still beside his desk for a long time, looking at a situation that his 40 years of careful, patient planning had never once prepared him for. The Varek military response was fast and large. They moved their main fleet toward the nearest captured gate with the full weight of their naval power, which was still, on paper, significantly greater than anything humanity had officially fielded. They were right about the numbers. They were completely wrong about almost everything else. The human commanders waiting for them were not working from alien doctrine. They were not working from a textbook at all. Human warfare had been shaped over centuries by one core experience: fighting opponents of equal or greater strength, in close quarters, on a single world, where losing meant the end. Human officers made decisions quickly. They changed tactics mid-engagement. They accepted losses that an alien commander would have retreated from, because human history had taught that sometimes the only path forward was through something that hurt. And they communicated with each other in ways that Varric tactical AI had not been designed to model. Quick, informal, emotional, full of shorthand and instinct that no algorithm had a clean response to. The first major fleet engagement lasted 4 hours. When it ended, the Varric had not broken through the gate perimeter. They had lost a significant number of ships. The human fleet had also lost ships, and the crew of every lost vessel had a name and a record, and people back home who would be told in person, not by form letter, because Okonkwo had insisted on that years ago. There were smaller moments scattered across the battle that found their way into the record later. Lieutenant Commander Adeyemi, aboard the Unbroken, diverted from his assigned patrol route when he picked up a distress signal from a damaged human fighter that had drifted into a debris field. He had no orders to do it. He did it anyway, bringing his ship alongside the wreck and physically guiding the 2 survivors through the transfer tube himself. He was back at his station 4 minutes later. His commander did not formally reprimand him. She noted the action in the log and said nothing else about it. During a boarding action against a Varric logistics ship, a squad of human marines moved through the narrow corridors in silence, working quickly and professionally. Before they breached the final compartment, their sergeant paused and said 3 names out loud, not as a battle cry, just quietly, to himself and the marines behind him. Voss, Anan Reyes, Marsh. Then he moved. At one point during the engagement, a Varric ceasefire request was routed to the Unbroken's command channel and passed on to Fleet Command. Okonkwo was in the middle of reviewing a tactical update when the message came in. She looked at the timestamp, looked at the tactical map, and handed the datapad back to the officer who had brought it. "Tell them I'm busy," she said. She was. On the other side of the galaxy, the Concordat was fracturing in real time. The Lethian delegation on Axis Prime announced that their government was declaring full neutrality and withdrawing from all active Concordat security arrangements. The Karathi followed within 6 hours. 3 smaller species did the same over the following day, saying little publicly, but making their position clear by the act of stepping back. The Sundry said more. The Sundry had long memories. Their government issued a public statement that acknowledged human rights in the Concordat had been systematically diminished for decades, and that the evidence against the 3 executed ambassadors was fabricated. They had received copies of Jarre's documentation and had verified it independently. They announced that their shipyards and resupply stations were open to the Sol Federation. A Karathi broadcaster named Veltas, one of the most widely listened to voices in that region of the galaxy, said something during an evening transmission that was clipped and shared and repeated until it became something close to a proverb. He said that everyone had watched and said nothing, and then the humans had bled, and now they were all watching what happened to the ones who had made them bleed. On Varric Prime, the High Council met in emergency session. Drovit's old report was pulled from the filing system and passed around the table. Nobody made eye contact with the person who had filed it away without response. The losses at the gate engagements were confirmed. The number of defecting Concordat species was confirmed. The status of the Helix Gate network, their network, the one they had held for 4 centuries, was confirmed. The session lasted 9 hours. At the end of it, Veth Saran was removed from this council seat. He was placed under internal investigation. The colleagues who had congratulated him 3 weeks ago did not look at him as he was escorted from the chamber. The Varric flagship broadcast a full-band ceasefire signal on the 22nd hour of the engagement. Every frequency, every channel, a simple message, stripped of diplomatic language. They were requesting a halt to hostilities. Okonkwo acknowledged the signal. She ordered the Stillwater fleet to hold position at the captured gates and cease offensive movement. Then she did something that nobody on either side had been expecting. She sent a message, not to the Varric, not privately, but on the same full-band channel the ceasefire had come through, so that every species in the Concordat received it at the same moment. It said, We are not here to conquer. We are here to make sure this never happens again. To anyone. Respond if you agree. The channel was quiet for a moment. Then, one by one, it began to fill. 3 months after the ceasefire, Geneva hosted visitors from 31 species for the first time in its history. The city had seen a great deal in its long life. It had hosted peace talks between nations that hated each other. It had been the seat of agreements that had stopped wars and started new ones. It had learned over centuries to accommodate powerful people with difficult histories sitting in the same room. But nothing in its past had quite prepared it for the sight of alien delegations walking its streets, past the cafes and the lake and the old buildings that had survived everything humanity had put itself through, on the way to the building where the Concordat would formally be put to rest. The summit was called the Reformation, though most people simply called it Geneva. It took 11 days. The Galactic Concordat, the governing body that had overseen 400 years of interstellar politics, built on the quiet assumption that some species mattered more than others, was formally dissolved on the third day, without ceremony, by a vote of 34-6. The 6 who voted against it were Varric-aligned worlds. The result was entered into the official record, and the Concordat seal was removed from the hall. What replaced it took longer to build. The Galactic Covenant was written by a working group that included representatives from 22 species, with significant human involvement in the language of the rights and protection sections. The humans who worked on those sections had brought historians with them. Not military historians, but people who specialized in the long story of how rights got written and then ignored and then fought for again. They had seen that cycle enough times on their own world to know exactly which words held up and which ones didn't. The Helix Gate network was placed under joint administration, overseen by a rotating council with no single species holding more than 1 seat at a time. The technical management was handled by a new body made up of engineers from 6 different species, with a human director for the first 5 years. The gates stayed open throughout. Trade never stopped. The transition happened around the traffic, quietly and efficiently. The Varec ascendancy was not destroyed. Okonkwo had been clear about that from the beginning, even when some of her own officers had pushed for something harsher. She had sat with them and said patiently that what they were building was not a new version of the old system with humanity at the top. That would not last, and it would not be worth what had been paid to get here. The Varec's military capacity was formally limited under the Covenant's terms. Their exclusive economic arrangements with smaller species were dissolved. Their crimes, the fabricated trial, the execution, the decades of accumulated manipulation, were placed on the permanent galactic record, acknowledged by their own surviving government as part of the negotiated settlement. Some Varec refused to accept this. Some retreated into anger and did not come out for a long time. But others, particularly younger ones, who had grown up uncertain about their government's methods, began reaching out in small ways. A cultural exchange program between Varic universities and human institutions was proposed by a Varic academic 6 weeks after the summit. It was modest and careful and nothing like friendship, but it was not nothing. The wound was deep. It was not closed, but it was not past healing. Jarry stood in the main hall of the Geneva summit on the 7th day and received the Sol Federation's Medal of Conscience in front of delegates from 31 species. She was a small figure in a large room, and she was not comfortable with the attention, which was perhaps why her speech was the most honest one given during the entire 11 days. She said that she had not acted out of bravery. She said she had been afraid for months before she sent that first message, and afraid every day after it. She said the reason she finally acted was not that the fear went away, but that something else became louder than the fear. She said that her people had looked away once before, a long time ago, when the Varic had restructured their trade routes and hollowed out their economy, and that they had spent 60 years regretting the silence. She said that when she watched the broadcast of the execution, she had felt that old regret come back. And she had decided that she was not going to add to it. She paused for a moment at the end, and said something that she had not planned to say. She said that she thought all the species in the room, her own included, had been waiting for someone brave enough to refuse to accept the way things were, and that it should not have had to be the humans alone who refused first. The room was very quiet after that. The humans in the room did not look triumphant. Most of them looked tired, in the way people look when something necessary and terrible is finally over. On the 9th day of the summit, a small ceremony was held at the Memorial of the Three, which had been completed in the square outside the main conference building during the weeks of negotiation. It was not a large structure. 3 figures in dark stone, life-sized, standing beside each other the way they had stood in the Hall of Concordance. No pedestals, no elevated platforms, just 3 people at street level, facing outward. Lieutenant Commander Yusuf Adeyemi came to the memorial in the early morning before the official delegations arrived. He was in his dress uniform, which he had pressed the night before with more care than usual. He stood in front of the memorial for a while, without speaking. Then, he reached into his jacket and took out 3 sealed letters, the ones he had given to the communications officer before the engagement, and collected afterward, worn at the edges now from handling. He left them at the base of the memorial, tucked against the stone. He did not explain why. He did not need to. He stood for another moment, then straightened his jacket, and walked back toward the conference building, where the day's work was waiting. On the last day of the summit, when the Galactic Covenant had been signed by 31 founding species, and the final documents were sealed and recorded, a young Sundry journalist caught up with General Okonkwo outside the main hall. Okonkwo was about to become the Sol Federation's first High Representative to the new Covenant. And the journalist had one question she wanted to ask before the formal appointments began. She asked if Okonkwo had been afraid, during the 30 days, that the Varric would not back down in time. Okonkwo stopped walking. She thought about the question honestly, which was the only way she knew how to answer anything. I was afraid, she said, of what we would have to become if they didn't. She paused. That's why they had to. The journalist wrote it down. Later, a Varric historian, one of the younger ones, working carefully through the newly opened records, would write something in an early chapter of what became the definitive account of those events. He was writing about the nature of the Sol Federation, about what had made them so difficult to account for in any strategic model. He wrote that the mistake, the original and most fundamental mistake, had been to look at humanity and see only their size, their declared fleet, their official position, their visible power. He wrote that the Varric had looked at humans and seen a species that could be managed. What they should have seen, he wrote, was a species that had spent thousands of years making itself ungovernable by anything it had not chosen to accept. He wrote that there was a certain kind of planet, quiet-looking, modest, easy to underestimate from a distance, that you should never, under any circumstances, decide to make an enemy of. He did not need to name it. Everyone who read the book already knew which planet he meant.